that we have been giving you. Do you mind just writing a couple of bullet points for each of the points? I know some of you have already been telling me some of this feedback. Mr. Chilton, you said that you want to tell me something. So there you are. You have the opportunity. And just a couple of bullet points while you are here and we are waiting for everybody to come in. And I'm going to ask the volunteers to start getting the people in. So 2 bullet points for each of the questions.
Es lo que temía, por eso lo dije, pregunté esta mañana. Ahí está la señora, ¿no está aquí? A lo mejor sí. Quizá no hayan llegado todavía. Not during the session.
Exactly. Aziza, there's another penalty. When we were at 9:30 in the evening, was that the original plan?
Exactly.
Yeah. The train leaves at 9:28, so...
Okay, I think we're waiting for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll try to start by the time you're done with your forms. Okay. Do we have translation? Because we have one of the panelists. We have one of the panelists that will be talking in Spanish. So if some of you need, and I'm sorry for that, if you have to quit the room and come back, the earphones, I think to listen to what our Mexican colleague will be saying, you will need translation.
Okay. Okay, so we start. Okay, thank you very much. It's 5 minutes past, I think, and we are now going to start the session on governance, key tools and lessons learned from implementation. The chair and facilitator is Aziz Ahmed from the OECD. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josefina. There is one thing that I want to do before we get into the substance. I want all of us to give all of us a big round of applause, because being here after 2 days and a half of intensive discussion is really a proof of your dedication, I would say, to the workshop. So thank you all. This was the first piece of news. The second is, because you are here, we will make sure that we spend as much time listening to you and giving you the floor for the questions as we do trying to summarize the discussions that have been taking place. So it's really my pleasure to chair one of the final panels here, a topic that has been coming back and forth, including in the report back that was done earlier today and this morning in particular, on the other themes, whether they relate to technology or to financing, that have all come back and again with some of the governance bottlenecks, with some of the governance responses needed. And I do hope that the panel and the feedback from the different stakeholder session will do justice to the many questions that have been raised thus far. I'd like before, and I thank the panelists for being here, before we get into each of the synthetic report back, maybe to step a bit back and go back to what we told ourselves the first day of the conference in terms of mapping what some of the key governance bottlenecks to a potential SDG on water implementation may be. And if you recall very well what we discussed in the plenary 2 days ago, there were issues related to, of course, the allocation of roles and responsibilities across service providers, across water managers, across policymakers, the role for regulators, and the need to take into account the fact that implementing an SDG on water, whatever the framework and the scope of that SDG, is a shared responsibility. And I think it will be very helpful to get back from the panelists some concrete guidance on what can be done from the point of view of civil society, from the point of view of academia and science, from the point of view of governments and also the private sector to make this happen. A second big issue that we could see also in all the discussions on WRM is related to the scale. And I think this is a very important concern. If you're going to have a high-level aspirational goal, you still need different levels of governments, different levels of geographical, hydrographical, territorial scales to make that happen. And I think the case studies that I've had the opportunity to hear here and there were really reflecting this diversity of scales, from sub-basins to global tools that have been presented. Third, and I think a key consideration, policy coherence. The water SDG is not only about what can be done within the water sector. A lot of the solutions can come from the energy sector, from the agriculture sector. We've also had a nice presentation of SDGs where we could see that some of the water-related targets are also meant to appear in other SDGs, and that's to be taken into account. Capacity, fourth item, whether it's institutional, financial, technical capacity. I think also here we have very concrete examples in terms of how this is being built, how changes also in the mindset, behavioral changes are triggered, the role of economic instruments amongst others in doing so. Data and information, I think we've had a lot of discussions on that. Probably we'll get some very concrete illustrations on what it means. And also maybe a bit of lagging behind in terms of what the distributional impacts of not having access to basic water and sanitation imply today, and how it can threaten water as a factor for growth and development. Financial resources, that was really the discussion we had this morning. A lot of the lack of that were pointed out by Moez and some of the civil society representatives have to do with governance. I mean, these are really issues that are at the core of what we will discuss here. Regulation, regulatory frameworks. We have a few regulators in the room. There is also a role for broader third-party mechanisms to ensure and to hold also the governments accountable for that implementation. Issues related to innovation, and we could see also in the feedback from the technology session that a lot of the current institutional and regulatory frameworks are not necessarily conducive to innovation. And whether this is technical or non-technical innovation, probably some of the tools in the toolbox that we have and the experience from the private sector and beyond can help. And last, the dimension that has to do with trust and engagement, and this has come back and back and back again, and I think that shrinking it to to political will is really not doing justice to what can be done and what it is in practice. I mean, integrity, transparency, issues related to stakeholder engagement, what makes it effective? I mean, it's not only being willing to put everybody around the table. It's being clear about how these inputs are used in the decision-making process. It's being clear about which institutional frameworks are actually creating the proper incentives and how you measure also the costs of stakeholder engagement against their benefits. And there's maybe a last point related to monitoring and evaluation, and another issue that was very well put on the table, I thought, by a few speakers earlier these 2 days on equity between now and in the future. The SDGs are going to cut across 15 years. The water climate is likely to change. The economic climate will be evolving as well. And in addition to equity between generations, there's certainly a dimension of equity between places. Can we have the same aspirational goals for rural, urban areas, and so on? So this is really just to recall, and that's again probably not comprehensive enough, but what some of the references to governance have been. The way we will organize that is that I will go back to each of the stakeholders, keeping in mind that really the objectives of these 2 days have been to identify some of the concrete tools that can bring responses to these issues, providing a bit of guidance also from your discussion on what can help scale up these tools and what prevents basically scaling up these tools. And maybe if you could, each of you, conclude with concretely what you think your constituency or not, or at least the constituency that you're representing here around the table can do to make sure that a water SDG can properly be implemented. So they have all 7 minutes. I will be the perfect dictator here and make sure that we stick to the rule and that this is not going to be much longer. And I hope we can get at least 35, 40 minutes to go back to you and also challenge either what was said, but above all, what was not said and you think deserves equal attention. So let me start first maybe by our representative from Mexico, from the Mexican Institute for Water Technology, Denise Suarez, who's leading the portfolio on social participation. Denise, you've been following very closely the discussions across governments on governance, and we keep saying that governance is not only governments. And you are really much welcome to share with us some of the experiences that came from your discussions. And that's in Spanish.
Sí. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
En mi mesa foi uma discussão muito rica, muito ampla sobre
table there was a very interesting debate on 4 countries: Myanmar, Spain, Mexico, and Brazil. Brazil, which was an experience, too rich experience. It is interesting to say that every experience, the strengthening of capacities, technology, and social participation, all these experiences are indicating where the processes that generate more water governance can be generated. And also we spoke about the incentive to social participation, the political will at all levels, which is very important to think that, not only to think on municipalities, but also to think how the government can create a platform for a more sustainable water management and also a more transparent accountability on the part of civil society. The institutions in our countries are still a bit weak in spite of having a regulatory framework that is the most adequate one. And we are far from being able to apply or to implement this framework thoroughly. Therefore, I would like to start tackling these experiences according to the different specific tools and the lessons learned. Myanmar carried out political and economical reform in light of the water scarcity. National Water Resources Committee was created to include the relevant actors related to water. It had 3 pillars: the consulting body, and it has developed a series of activities like strengthening the capacities of the ministries, development of technological and scientific projects, scientific forum, in order to awaken curiosity on the part of the audience and the citizenship. Also actions with women and young people in order to raise awareness. The lessons learned by Myanmar is that the priority has to be the preservation of water resources in order to promote a good water governance. As for Spain, we saw the recovery of the Segura River basin with an integrated management. Spain is very well advanced in the water management and basin management, precisely because since 1926 they have been using this format, integrating the different users. Also by the water transfers from the Tajo River to the Segura River, which has entailed a great hydraulic work, public work. Also the recycle of water, of wastewater, the desalination, and the prevention of floods. The lessons learned is the value of the water scarcity, and this is linked to a co-responsibility on the part of the users. Without the role of technology, we cannot improve the well-being of the citizenship. In Brazil, it was the Cultivando Agua Boa program that, apart from quantitative results, is obtaining or reaching to qualitative results, because they focus on the care for the nature and its resources, empowering the social actors, because they are not longer listeners only, they are also actors. They are managing also microspaces, microbasins, and they empower everybody to participate in the decision-making process. There is a participative monitoring of the water quality, and also they train the trainers. This is an horizontal experience to strengthen capacities, and the lessons learned with a methodology oriented towards touching the hearts of the people, dreaming. It is possible to replicate this experience wherever, taking water as an axis, creating and constructing a participatory framework. In Mexico, they promote the decentralization of the drinking water services and the irrigation farming, where the municipalities, the municipalities who assume the responsibilities, and the irrigators are in charge of the smaller structures, and the bigger structures are managed by the government. They didn't generate enough amount of local capacities, and therefore this fact presented a problem. Nowadays, they are implementing the National Water Program, and it has changed for a sectorial paradigm to a multi-sectorial paradigm, including participation of the civil society. Now it would be interesting to speak, starting from these experiences, how to escalate successful local stories to a public policy. Not only marginal experiences, but the axis of a policy of a country, of a whole country, how the exchange of experiences in other countries can help to formulate your own policies. Also, we have many indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, and we should be advancing to a more thorough understanding of what these indicators indicate, always thinking that the goal of technology and management is not only the construction of the public works in itself, but to see whether it can generate conditions to transparent accountability. We have to advance a lot in our countries in terms of transparency and how to manage smartly the resources, taking into account the constant political changes. For example, the mayors or the municipal officials are changing every 3-4 years, and it is important to see how, in spite of these rapid changes, the policies can be kept and can exist over these changes and on a longer run, and how we change from centralized and self-autocratic paradigms, we can change into more participatory decision-making processes.
Applause. Let's do that. That's very good. Thank you for sharing a range of governance instruments that actually go from interministerial coordination, as you pointed out, in Myanmar, and the role of the National Water Committee, and also breaking some of the silos that we emphasized on day one. The role of planning in Spain, I often like to recall that one of the sons of John Lennon, for those of you that are fans of John Lennon, was recalling that life is what happens when everybody spends time doing plans. I mean, of course, and I agree very much with one of the comments that was made earlier. And I also think we tend to overestimate the power of planning in ensuring good governance per se. This is certainly a contribution to it, but that also has to go with some room to adjust to uncertainty and the room for flexibility that is needed not to be locked into suboptimal outcomes. The role of civil society awareness raising, I think that was very clear from your feedback on Brazil, and that participatory monitoring that is also gaining traction in many countries, especially in moving from top-down to bottom-up policy making, and the decentralization in Mexico making a bit of a difference between water supply and sanitation, that indeed is by the Constitution a prerogative of municipalities, and water resources management that remains somewhat centralized, or at least deconcentrated, as we would say, with the way river basin organizations are functioning. I like your conclusion about the fact that the role of governments is to make sure that public policies help to deliver that, and that it implies not only incentives, and that's both the stick and the carrot, but also managing the short and long-term dichotomy and the user's interest and the general interest. That's probably where indeed the institutional and regulatory frameworks can help. So thank you for that. That probably raised a few questions later in the audience. Let me move from government to civil society, maybe. Nice shortcut. And I'll give the floor to Rudolf Cleveringa from the Global Water Partnership. Rudolf?
Yeah, I'll use this one. I won't be speaking as quickly as Denisa, so not so much because it gives you maybe more time to reflect, but just because I can't. So first of all, thanks very much for the scene setting by Aziza, of course also by all the preparatory work done by Alice and Bart, and many of the organization headed here by Josefina. Thanks to you all, sincere thanks. I think the background materials are really smashing, very good. Now come the provisos, right? So what you hear now is the views of the participants in our session yesterday, 4 sessions that conclude the whole day, where we, of course, informed by these background materials, explored the relationship, the governance relationship between civil society and government. We did not do what the other groups did, which is also explore the governance of business, also explore the governance of private sector, and what have you not. Let me just briefly remind you of the essence of one of the principles of the Dublin Declaration X many years ago. Probably some of us might recall when that was, and I will not take a vote because the audience is not set to be very interactive. The Dublin principles were all about a P word. Which was the P word? Participation, there you go. Okay, so Dublin 92, we had now a decade and a bit of the Millennium Development Goals, which were basically the North telling the South what it had to do so that the North could refrain from mitigating. I think one of the lessons learning is actually set by our own mental framework that we come from the MDGs, and we're not ready yet to have learned with the South for the South. So that's one of the other provisos. So let's be a bit aware of that our lessons learning come from another context and may not immediately be relevant for the different challenges. A new challenge. The World Economic Forum has again voted water crisis as a global risk. Well, anybody surprised in this room? Preaching to the converted again, once more? So what's new? Well, we have the SDGs. We have, of course, the whole climate change, the COP, the disaster risk reduction agendas. But we also have the new trade arrangements that are around the corner between the US and Europe. And I haven't particularly heard anybody referring to how that may affect governance either through civil society roles or others. So what I will share with you is certainly not comprehensive. They're hand-picked contributions from our group work over the day. But let me open with a statement that was given by Aziza, and it was that we're all here to share findings on shared responsibilities with regard to the SDG implementation. Just as a permanent reminder, and if I go off track, please, Aziza, panelists, audience, please help me. Okay, so we hear a lot about civil society. Well, to make it short, there is no single civil society. We ought to change our thinking more in terms of pluralism, of diversity. There are many civil societies. Yeah, and I think it's going to be key that we understand that that diversity is an endowment, a point of richness, and not something negative. So please, when we refer to civil society now and in the future, let's just very well be conscious that we're talking about civil societies. A second issue is that, and it was my party lines were already stolen here. We've heard trust, or actually we've heard more about the lack of it, or even worse, mistrust. I'm not going to coin who said it in which context, but I think this has been one of the red threads throughout these days, actually the decade, and will be a red threat with a T for the next 15 years. Now, why is this? Because we still keep equating governance with government. You stole my party line. You said it's not the same, and indeed it's not the same. And I think we need to join forces to rub it in, because people still tend to think of government will take care of rules and regulations. And Colin helped us be a bit more, aggressive in that sense. And no, we have to make sure that governance is a shared responsibility. So, trust building. Trust building is a predictable process, kind of mechanistic way of linking people. Anybody from Sri Lanka? No. Anyway, of course not. You can't build trust in a mechanic way. It's a process. It's a mindset. It's a behavior. Yeah, and it takes two to tango. Yeah, trust is not something only you have in yourself. Of course, that's called self-confidence. But trust is something you need to build, and it goes 2 steps ahead, 3 aside, and maybe some kind of a complex tango. This trust, by the way, is not just trust building between civil societies and government, but also within civil societies. We heard this earlier session about co-acting and the incentives missing to co-act, and actually that many civil society organizations, government funded or NGOs or wherever the funds come from, are competing, are fragmented, or, to quote Jack, are at least segmented. Segmentation is good, because that's representation, representativeness. Fragmentation is not good. The water sector is overly fragmented, both in government as well as on the civil society's side. Can't speak for business, but Michael just gave you a line to refer to. So when we do refer to trust building, please, the process is equally long for trust building within the civil societies and between them. So trust is indeed the key ingredient for inclusive and equitable governance of water. What a stupid word. I mean, at least in Spanish you say gobernabilidad. También. Sí. And I wonder what the French say. They probably say something else like, well, never mind. And voilà, donc on a gouvernabilité et gouvernance. This is just to please the translators, never mind. So what is it then that in concrete terms we were reminded of by case studies from Myanmar, from Latin America, from Pakistan, from the Near East? It's I would say what we extracted from it in terms of lessons and what seems to be working is hold governments accountable on the good governance principles, on the delivery of policies that work, and policies, again, that enhance the role of civil societies in this enforcement. By the way, when you hear much about government and civil society, people throw away tons of acronyms. What's the acronym of your outfit?
MSU.
Okay. And yours?
Which acronym?
Acronym. In French. Okay. ¿Tuyo? L'acronimio de tu organización? IMTA. Okay. Anybody see any names and faces? Yes, thank you. So actually, this trust building is not about acronyms. It's about people's interactions. And the people interact in the flesh, eye to eye. So with or without smart ICT. Guys, it's not going to substitute for these kind of encounters, not just here in Zaragoza, but also in Myanmar, in Pakistan, in the places that have been mentioned. So whereas smart ICT can support these kind of processes, it should not be substituting for them because the donors only give us 9.8% overheads. Okay, yeah, I came from that angle, so I just do something naughty on my own tent, I guess, on my former tent. Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples was one of the main, if you want, drivers and concern in our deliberations, because very often indigenous peoples, as stewards of land and water, say resources as well as biodiversity richness, are very much marginalized. And the very same second, the economists put a value on the way they handle their resources, their land, their water, very often we find that these people are immediately dispossessed of what was hitherto worthless. So the minute we put a value on something, snap and it's gone, right? So indigenous peoples have a lot to offer, expertise, yeah, behavior, mindsets. They are also extremely vulnerable to our economic thinking. And that requires a different, if you want to, attitude and a different angle to governance. We hear a lot about participation, and the overall finding of the different sessions, and if you want to, international literature as well, is participation pays. But do we need to pay for participation? Because the marginalized people, the CSOs, the NGOs, the abbreviations, have no access to funds to participate. So that's a question that we deliberated, and of course, we couldn't immediately come up with an answer, but we had another context, another challenge, if you want to, and the group of economists here addressed this issue. We got billions of dollars sitting idle in accounts, international accounts, because there's no capacity to absorb this money. Yet, pre-investments, if you want to, or investments in people's capacities to participate in the decision-making around it, I know that's a yellow card. All right.
That's a red one, actually.
No.
Been sending
I know.
for a while.
I'll sit over here. Joanne, move over here. Yeah. So participation pays. Do we need to pay for participation? In the context of being equal partners, equally informed and equally, empowered to do so. Jean-Marc opened this morning with it pays to listen, yeah? And that takes time. Donors don't have time. Governments have 3-year, 5-year cycles, and that's it. So if we really want to listen, we need to be more perseverance-driven. We have to have longer time horizons, not just 3 to 4 year democratic cycles. Okay, I'll skip this one. It's too much. Scaling up. Scaling up, we heard a lot about replication, about doing away with obstacles, but we have not come to a somewhat more analytical framework that addresses, say, the spaces and drivers of scaling up. Brookings has done some leading work on that, and I recommend that be revisited. I'll conclude with some of the aspects that were considered innovations. And Bart, where is he? Where's Bart? No waving in the...
This is not nice to give names because...
All right, where is the one who represents the youth parliament? Never mind, I don't... Oh, there's one, Elias, yeah. Okay, there's a name, sorry, Elias. We found that youth indeed is a driver and agent of communication, and that whereas there is a dedicated goal under the SDGs for women, there is no such goal for youth. There are targets for youth. Yeah, in 4 and 8 and 13. By the way, there's no SDG to my generation, the third generation. Now, if we talk about the SDG as an intergenerational contract for the next 15 years, how come I'm not there, right? So I'll start my own CSO.
I ask you to wrap up, please.
I am there. I knew you'd do this. It's fine. So youth for us is going to be key if we want to really drive the SDGs home. The old farts will not do it. Governance of communication is going to be key. Not just the physical access of it, but actually the use of the big data. We had some wonderful experiences from Bangladesh and Eastern Africa. Another element that we considered as a relative innovation is the inclusion of consumers. We heard it in other groups earlier today, but in our own deliberations, we found insufficient attention to consumer behavior, and particularly consumer behavior towards branding. Yeah? Branding of products that have a high water and land footprint, etc. You can go on that way. Green jobs is what I'll finish with. And we think there is a potential, too, to look into the governance of how social security networks, how work guarantee initiatives like the one in India that we dwelled on, how they can be geared, as the ILO is investigating and putting forward in the World Water Development Report, as CIWI is doing next year in the Water and Jobs, how indeed green jobs can be created in participation with civil society so that indeed the public policies driving these green jobs are delivering. And with that, please hold us accountable to the 4 questions that Aziza raised, and we'd be open, all of us who are here, to enter into your comments and precious suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudolf. Thank you. Thank you for recalling where we come from, actually, and the international process behind the 1992 conference, which, in addition to participation, also acknowledged water being an economic good. I think that's something that also needs to be pointed out, linking governance to financing and to the discussions that we had this morning. Let me move to business now and ask Mike Spencer, coming from Australia's water stewardship, and to share with us some of the insights from the business community.
Thanks. I was dreading this session after lunch on the last day, but coming from a standards background, I'm not intuitively like this, but when Josefina sort of gave us some questions and some topics, I immediately produced a matrix so I could address every question and every topic, but I think that's one of the things standards does. It actually does drive outcomes in a certain format. But enough of that. I'll try and make this as quick as possible and as relevant. We've talked about what we mean by governance. I guess in our discussions we talked about 3 issues: the role of government, non-government or voluntary governance arrangements, and water or catchment governance. These aren't silos, they are interdependent, and they do all influence how business can contribute to achieving the SDGs in different ways. Let me explain. The role of government, in its traditional role as a maker of laws and regulations in relation to water, and the provider of public goods such as water. Non-government governance, if you like, is a voluntary commitment by business to deliver certain agreed outcomes in partnership with government and civil society. Water or catchment governance refers to the arrangements put in place to manage catchments, watersheds, water basins, and their issues. So over the day of our discussions, we touched on each of these forms of governance. And there was particular interest by business during the day in working with voluntary tools under the heading of corporate water stewardship. Corporate water stewardship could not and should not be driven by CSR or PR strategies, was a point that Paul made early in our proceedings. To be effective, they have to be part of the business and be driven by a business case. So one of the lessons to emerge was the importance of developing a strong and compelling business case for corporate water stewardship. This means linking it to business goals and objectives, as well as keeping barriers to entry such as costs and the provision of infrastructure low. I'll come back to corporate water stewardship, but so I don't overlook some of the other things we talked about, I'll briefly touch on those. We talked about CDP Water and the role of that program in promoting transparency and influencing investment decisions in a way that might discriminate against non-sustainable investment and toward investment that supports the SDGs. This transparency can itself be a tool for government in pursuing SDGs. But it can also be hindered by government in relation to the way that some laws, such as corporate laws, can devalue the pursuit of SDGs by promoting profit maximisation. One avenue that the CDP Water has looked at to circumvent or work around this is by working directly with stock exchanges on their listing rules and how their listing rules can embrace elements of the SDGs and encourage reporting and transparency. We had an example from the IDB and how it attempts to support SDGs through a combination of SDG-based funds and commercial funds. This example has been mentioned earlier, obviously, in the finance section. But it raises an interesting issue in relation to the regulatory environment in which finance exists. I was having a meeting with one of our banks at home just last week, who mentioned that as part of their natural value project, they wanted to provide preferential loans to organisations that were pursuing a management of natural capital strategy, but they immediately started to run into regulatory problems in terms of capital adequacy, etc., etc. So there's an issue there that needs to be addressed if we really want to break through here. We talked about regulation of pollution and how this has been referred to as the blind side of water, the area that we sometimes neglect and forget about. That this is dependent on political will, leadership and the capabilities of regulators. We talked about the need for consistency and measurement of performance. Is there a tool that we can develop to support the SDGs that promotes best practice in pollution regulation? And also for business, we talked about where business can provide leadership in how it deals with pollution and where the regulatory environment is inadequate or it doesn't have the capability, business can contribute to promoting that regulatory environment or simply demonstrating best practice. And we had an example yesterday of one of the companies that had a water treatment plant as part of its operation, and use that to role model good corporate behaviour. We talked about outsourcing and public-private partnerships. Successful PPPs, we were told, depend not on whether the private provider just meets its contractual commitments, but whether it meets customer and community expectations. If we're going to make use of these arrangements because they offer efficiency enhancement or overcome a lack of capital, then as we saw outside the Mayor's office just this week, they need to overcome emotional arguments by exceeding the expectations of their contract. They need to, as was made clear yesterday, meet the expectations of the final customer, the public. So again, is there a tool that can be developed that promotes and exemplifies best practice? We also talked about the quality of water governance and water governance indexes. Again, this is a tool built around describing and promoting best practice. But do we have a definition of best practice water governance? Would an index such as that developed in Singapore for the ADB be appropriate? Are international comparisons appropriate where water is a local issue and national governance may be driven by different priorities? So there's some of the examples we talked about. Let me just turn back to water stewardship, because we talked about 4 different uses of the term water stewardship. We talked about the UN CEO water mandate, the European water stewardship system, the Alliance for Water Stewardship System, and the International Council on Mining and Metallurgy water stewardship guidelines. Believe it or not, these all work together quite seamlessly. The Alliance for Water Stewardship and the European Water Stewardship System both offer water stewardship standards and a compliance system. The European system is part of the Global Alliance. The standards are very similar and focused on the same 4 broad outcomes of sustainable water balance, good water quality, healthy important water-related areas, and good water governance. The system offers mutual recognition between the international and the European standard, and over the next 2 years the standard and verification process will be further aligned. So for all intents and purposes they are one system. The UN CEO mandate corporate water stewardship program sits within the broader UN Global Compact and requires voluntary commitment to a set of principles of good water stewardship. The system is supported by guidance materials such as the Guidance for Corporate Engagement on Human Rights to Water, which was released yesterday during the session, and guidelines on engagement with stakeholders in the public sector. It's a system that's intended to articulate and promote best practice among the world's leading major water users. The CEO mandate is a member of the Alliance for Water Stewardship. Activities are complementary. At some point, we would hope that members of the mandate will want to have their performance verified against the global standard. So the 2 systems are again complementary. The ICMM guidelines on water stewardship for member companies, they've been drawn from all these different systems to outline what the ICMM sees as relevant to its members. Again, it's providing a pathway into this system that as companies move in and engage with this concept of water stewardship, they will progress to the point where at some point in the future they will seek to have their performance verified against a global standard. So if we can look at this at a package, what are the key ingredients? One is that water stewardship creates a focus for business on holistic water policy. CDP Water found that many businesses understood they had a risk exposure to water, but were struggling with how to respond to that risk. Water stewardship provides a framework around which they can create a water strategy, and I've got direct experience with some of the companies I've been working with. It encourages collaboration with government and civil society. It encourages business to understand water issues within their catchment, i.e. outside of their gate. It encourages transparency in water reporting, encourages business to take a leadership role in their catchment. Importantly, it's built around outcomes that are measured at a catchment and at a site level. So water stewardship is a very powerful tool that can help in meeting the SDGs. But it's not without its challenges. Using social and environmental standards to address gaps in public policy has been around for 2 decades now, there are a number of systems. So we need to encourage collaboration between standardising organisations. We need to focus on reducing complexity for business, small and large, by working with systems they might already be using, such as best management practices. We need to be mindful of the costs and shouldn't be reinventing perfectly sensible systems. And we need to provide a stepwise opportunity for business to engage. If we can do all that, we do have the ability to engage business in delivering SDGs. In building this around a business case, we channel business interests in managing risks, enhancing social licence and building a brand around a global framework or standard that reflects the broader interests of the SDGs. To ensure this is the case, I would encourage people to actually get involved in the review of the Global Water Stewardship Standard, which is conveniently scheduled to take place in 2016 after the finalisation of the SDGs. Which, of course, brings us back to governance and the importance of a multi-stakeholder governance system being at the heart of corporate water stewardship. But that's not as easy as it sounds and needs to be carefully thought through. Simply saying we want to involve stakeholders and inviting them to participate does not constitute good multi-stakeholder governance. We all have a responsibility, and we've heard this through the day, to show respect for stakeholders, particularly civil society, who have poor resources and often depend on voluntary contributions. Multi-stakeholder governance does need a review to the whole process of stakeholder engagement, but that's a bigger question for another day.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this very thorough feedback on what was discussed. Actually, there are a few very important points in what you made. This three-level distinction of governance, what relies on governments and what is more in the self-governance part of it, and many of the examples that you gave about the CEO water mandate and the water stewardship fits into that block. Very concrete examples from certification standards, labeling. This is very useful for the toolbox that will come out of this conference. There was also a lot of discussions around the climate bond initiative in that section, the role of new institutional investors and how the governance climate is actually either challenging their proper engagement or conducive to it. I think that's interesting. I think you made a point about the business case, and that's very, very helpful, either because it is a commercial risk or a market opportunity, but you need a business case for thorough engagement of the private sector, and that is something that has come across your discussions in your session. There's maybe a point that I would like to throw for the group discussion later that you raised about how to measure governance and these water governance assessments and index that I think goes in parallel to the discussion about the implementation of the SDG, because what will follow the adoption of the SDGs is the adoption of an indicator system that can support the implementation. And there, if you have two dedicated targets within the water goal that are related to governance, you'd better be prepared in terms of how you're tracking their implementation. And there's a lot to be taken from parallel work on that, based on perception-based and fact-based indicators, as we said in the first day. So thank you very much for this feedback. I'm sure this will raise a lot of questions. Let us turn last but not least to our colleague Joanne from Michigan State University to reflect a bit on what came out from academia in the discussions.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I've enjoyed the last few days and all the discussion we've had. So I think we started out our session, and I thought it was very interesting that science was essential for good governance, and that the academic world had a very important role to play in producing data, but providing access to the information, and in particularly knowledge transfer, which is one of our challenges that was identified. But more importantly, the academic world is going to be responsible for producing the next generation of the people who will be in charge, whether it'll be the policymakers, the scientists, the engineers, the social scientists engaged in water. So we have that responsibility, and that is also one of our challenges. We ended the day, I thought was quite interesting, with a presentation on how the academic world was playing and scientists were playing a role in implementation of some of the SDGs at some of the local levels. And so I think we're already doing this. We're already providing, we're already taking on these challenges. But how do we expand it? How do we do it better? How do we create a global mandate? Because some areas are doing it better than others. So our key challenges that were certainly identified was the knowledge transfer. That is taking our data, our information out of the academic world and transferring it so that it truly meets the definition of knowledge, and that is usefulness in decision-making process. Clearly, academic scientists have a mandate to publish. Now, however you feel about that in terms of, your tenure, and providing funding for your research program and all of that, which is always a challenge. I think the written word carries a lot, and so we do believe in writing things down, getting things published, getting things peer-reviewed, and that peer review does help in evidence-based at the governance level. And so we think that is still important, but how do we do it better for best practices, for practical science? What you might call engaged research with the community. There's always data gaps, but that wasn't really one of the challenges that I don't think that was identified. It's these recalcitrant problems, what we call the wicked problems, and certainly water is one of those. And by definition, that means there's no endpoint, there's no answer. It means that there's an adaptation, there's learning. Can we get better? And it was brought up over and over again. It's this human-coupled natural system that we're living in today's world. It's the climate, water energy interface. It's the interface of water and biodiversity goals and human health. So these are some of these key challenges. But some tools were presented. I think someone mentioned the water safety plans. We had a very nice case study from Vietnam in which the water safety plan and how that could be evolved to source water and sanitation from Vietnam, because it ensures pathways for science and data to enter into the system. And it also creates a platform for the stakeholder engagement, for policymakers, for scientists, for others to come together. We also talked about the Quantitative Microbial Risk Assessment Framework, which is a framework being used by WHO for health targets, and how that could be applied particularly to sanitation. And that goes to ecosystem services as well. We had a nice presentation about tools, the academic developing tools, so that their data and information can be used by the community that needs this information, and the training that goes along with it. So a very specific tool, whether it's an app or whatever it is, that goes along with the appropriate information. And then I thought there was a very interesting example of a recent project in which they actually put funding in for what they called a knowledge broker. So it was designated monies for someone that was to really look at knowledge and knowledge transfer. And that was their job. I think that we're offering some new tools, and the issue is how to get those tools out there, because I heard about the political will, and I think these new technologies and tools allow for resolution of information that helps us make better decisions, and it's how to get it out there. And it's everything from remote sensing, very high scale, right, at the watershed scale, to new tools for groundwater assessment, to molecular tools. And I can tell you, if we say there's hepatitis A virus in your water, or there's cholera in your water, does that mean more than thermotolerant fecal coliforms, in your water? And I've been in places where, yes, it means more. So that resolution of information from the various scales helps move the political will. Now, I'm going to end by talking about the obstacles and solutions, sort of as two sides of the coin. This providing the human capacity or the human resources. I think that there was a lot of discussion, especially from our colleague from South Africa, about educating Africans from the various countries, and them being the sole expert when they go back and feeling very isolated. There were some good suggestions about making sure we have associations, that we keep the professional associations going, and this can network, but also things like cluster hires and funding actually potentially centers of excellence where you can do cluster education. You can educate at the interface between, say, water and policy, science and policy, and can provide these, what we call the interactive expertise. That is truly people that are experts in two fields. And we don't have to educate too many of those. If we set some targets for some of these key people to go back, they will take leadership roles. So the other thing was just the whole communication of science, not just within these frameworks, but to the public themselves. And how do we take our science out of the academic world in with perhaps the media and provide more communication of the science to the public and even to the broad civil societies, right? Societies. There we go. We don't. There is a movement towards multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, those two different things. Somebody mentioned transdisciplinary. That's actually creating a new field, transdisciplinary, and I think we're pretty far from in the water space to go to transdisciplinary. But I think we do multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary pretty well. And in some institutions, this is being supported. And it's being supported by larger funding. It mandates that you have the different disciplines at the table, including social science. But in some places, it's not a global phenomenon, as was brought up in our session. There are some, institutions in various parts of the world, in low-income countries, for example, that have not said, how are we going to facilitate within the academic system interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary projects, and also fund those, because those may require larger money. So how do we create that more at the global level? The success stories around multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. And I thought it was very interesting because, even the research in governance itself that's evolving demonstrated that one size does not fit all. And I think that's been talked about. And there's the issue of scaling, either upscaling. If you're doing something local, can you scale that up and get it into the national strategic plans? Or downscaling, if you're doing something at a global level or a national or a transboundary, can it come down and be implemented at some of the local level? So this scaling. And the whole idea of adaptive government for very complex problems where there's no consensus, to adaptive management where there's more consensus and you can move through the process maybe relatively easy, or this co-management. And one size does not fit all, and it does not mean that stakeholder involvement is equal in those processes. And so we're learning more about what works where. And an example of these things was storage, for example. If you have a lot of storage, or storage is one of your issues, that's an issue that can be addressed with a more adaptive management approach. But droughts, even the scientific assessment of droughts or the prediction of droughts or how we use information around droughts for strategies, management, and governance strategies are very difficult. So that goes down to the other end, and we've heard about this whole issue of climate. I think that government policy effectiveness and solutions, that the academic world, if we move it in the right direction, can create a voice for societal benefits. We are already being asked in our grants, whether they're individual grants or larger grants, and especially these multi-year larger grants, to address outcomes and impacts and societal benefits. And so can we create then robust policies that are not as subject to the short-sightedness of the political environment? And that should be some of the goals we should think about as we merge with these larger multidisciplinary programs. I think there's a great interest in the academic community in the water space to work on the SDGs at the front end, are providing data, information, knowledge transfer, as well as an implementation on the ground. Funding is always an issue, and so some percentage where that can come into the institution, of course, allows that participation. And I think you mentioned that, the issue of participation and student participation in particular, because that is part of their education. And one of the key things is the pilot and demonstrating. In the water space, we need to pilot and demonstrate, especially innovation. If we're going to an evolution and try new innovative technology, maybe it's easier maybe on the sanitation side, I'm not sure, although I think we haven't tried it as far. These piloting and demonstrations are extremely important. And the academic world is doing that very well with evidence-based assessment and reporting out and peer review. And I think that that's going to be extremely important. So there's a lot of interest here, I think, in the academic community to continue to support this process.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanne, for the few points you made, and I liked very much the reference to how to move from knowledge transfer to knowledge sharing, and the role of peer review there is very useful in this science policy interface. You've pointed out a few gaps related to capacity and outreach. I think the examples you gave, and the one in particular related to pilot and experimentation, is a very good proof that you can learn not only from successful tools but also from failures. And I think that this is something that deserves to be pointed out. So I will stop here. I think we're not that bad. We have roughly 25 minutes if we take into account that we started quite late. I will give you the floor. If you could please keep focused in your questions, comments, and mention whenever it's a question who it is targeting. I have a first gentleman there. Is someone circulating the microphones in the team? Yeah. Yeah. There on the top. Do I have more people asking for the floor? Yeah. If you could please introduce yourself also when you take the floor.
Hello, is that okay? Hello, John Chilton from IAH. Having played, taking Joachim's analogy, having played all the way through the first half, from some of the countries that I know very well, and talking about WASH and coverage and access, there are some important governance challenges related to procurement and contracting and supervision and transparency and corruption. And these are really governance issues because it involves government, it involves the private sector, it involves communities, regulators, everybody's involved, and it's a real governance challenge for the next part of our work. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take 2-3 questions before we get back to the panelists, and I have a view on that one. This is an area where we do a lot of work at the OECD. So I have a floor here. Someone else? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing to and raising the issue around knowledge transfer. I'd agree. I want to reemphasize that that's a huge gap, and it's a particular skill set to do that. And my question to Joan is, in addition to the longer studies that are needed and the evidence and peer-reviewed publications, could you speak to the opportunity also to be collaborating on what's being called action research or practical research, providing the scientific methodology, but that can have a more quick turnaround that can support action that's happening in sort of real time, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that there's a movement towards a set of principles for what we call engaged community research, which is very practical. And the principles are timeliness, involvement with the community and the stakeholders in the communities in design, so that the cost and the outcomes, what the expectations can be managed, because someone may come to the scientific community and say, can you answer this? And they say, oh, yeah, if you give me $1 million. But no, we only have $10,000. And timeliness is very important, and then communication. So these principles of engaged research, and then the communication has to be both in written form and in oral form. So you have to go back into the community and talk about the data, the science, and you work directly with managers at that local level. Now, so can we create a peer review of some of these reports? And that can maybe be done if you're working at the state level. The state may have a system, some kind of board, in which some of these reports can go through a less, long-term traditional, and where the journals aren't going to take that kind of information anyway. So there are ways in trying to develop these principles of what we call the academic engaged community research, where we take our knowledge, our tools, but out into the community. And so those are some approaches that are trying to be developed. And timeliness is also one of the principles. Can we do it in the right amount of time for decision making?
Any of the other speakers on that? That was the first question on public procurement. You want to give it a start?
Well, actually, first of all, thank you for bringing up the rather complex issue of fraud and corruption. In our sessions, we try to pick up on the required capacities and the space that civil society would need to conquer in order to be more informed about the rules of procurement, the bidding, the tendering, all the technicalities that are usually in the small print of the international funding agreements. I think it's extremely important that maybe, Michael, this goes over to you, that in the context of the stewardship arrangements, that there is a kind of an alliance, not only just with business who does this procurement, but also delivers them through the tendering, whatever, that in that sense there is the build-up of a monitoring capacity to a joint one I refer to, which would ensure that your 3-star system actually gets always the highest points, not just because of your internal assessments of compliance with, but also because civil societies, whoever is involved in this case, can actually then say, yes, and this applies to us as well. So this would be a win-win, actually, rather than a control function. So with that, maybe over to Michael shortly.
The answer is yes, that the first point in the stewardship system is compliance with laws and regulations, and the last point is communication, disclosure, transparency, and stakeholder feedback. So, it's well built into that system, but again, experience is going to give us better feedback, and I expect we'll strengthen that. I think it's an excellent point.
I'm wondering if universities can play a bigger role as an honest broker. In many surveys around the world, they say that they trust the universities, and maybe not so much with some of the upfront, activities, but certainly in conflict, when there's conflict and other things, you can create a safe place, a trading zone, so to speak, where ideas can really be traded in a safe haven. And so that's one of the ideas is that can universities play some kind of role as an honest broker in some of these areas.
Y el combate a la corrupción tiene que estar vinculado.
The combat against corruption has to be very much linked to this, because we are not going to have societies that are going to demand accountability if they are worried or concerned about not letting their population die of diarrhea or other types of diseases, because in that case the main thing is the access to information and how the people have this access to demand these transparent processes. And don't think of government corruption, think about business corruption or organizations corruption too.
I think it's not just the procurement of the service per se and how much is lost in that context. I think with my old hat on, we found a lot of corruption, if you want to, in non-compliance with quality criteria, in ordinary English, shoddy work, which really was representing an enormous tragedy and risks to communities that had mobilized their labor, their knowledge, had made land available, had come up with the building materials and the siting and all those wonderful stories, to then find that the companies or the decentralized agencies of whatever government had done such a lousy job that actually the work done represented a larger risk to water security than having the situation as was before. Yeah. So the complex of the services and the procurement goes beyond the service itself and would include the quality of. And you can only have a quality control if people are informed, like you were saying, Denise, not just informed, but capacitated to say how you compact this dam, etc. Let's not get any further from our side. Maybe back to the chair.
No, I mean, I fully agree. I think there are two sides. I mean, two steps in your question. One is, do you have the public procurement rules in place that can actually prevent abuses that we know are distorting not only the market but also raising risks in terms of economic efficiency and financial sustainability? And my response to that is that this is something that is exogenous to the water sector. This is a principle of good governance to have in place public procurement rules that are ensuring legal certainty while allowing for flexibility, but also making sure that there is value for money and that end users are protected, and especially in a sector where it's largely capital intensive and relies on heavy infrastructure and lends itself to also abuses from some of the monopolistic position. That's one thing. But I think related to that is which types of governance instruments and third-party mechanisms you have in place to make sure that enforcement properly takes place. And what we observe in many countries, and there I would dissent from what you say, it's not only countries that have fixed their economic and social problems, you have huge issues of transparency also, especially in the water sector in countries that are not developing countries, is which types of mechanisms you have in place. And some countries have heavy regulators, for example, that are independent agencies that are in charge of ensuring compliance. Others have courts of audits, for example, that are shedding greater light of that. Observatories can play that role. Participatory monitoring that was said. There is definitely a role for civil society there also as a third-party mechanism. So I think it's the typical situation where you see that governance principles outside the water sector apply specifically to the water sector, because this is where some of the market failures are exacerbated, of course. Do we have last questions or reactions or comments before I give the floor back to the panelists in case? So we have Elena here.
It's kind of fairly unformulated, but there's an interesting initiative on open government, which I think has to shift to open governance. In a way, I wanted to kind of ask each panelist to reflect what does it mean in their own, because for example in academia it's all this Creative Commons, huge issue with intellectual property rights, publishing companies, huge issue. In the civil sector, I think NGOs, as you said, this idea of coaction or competition. So open governance also applies to the NGOs, to kind of synergies rather than, obviously also for government. I mean, in Spain we just passed a transparency law and it's already very deficient. So in developing countries, yeah, in developed countries, sorry, I call it developing because we're in a crisis. But, and also, obviously, the private sector, data, for example. I mean, quite often you're the one that have the most money. So in a way, you will be the ideal one to say complement, for example, in a kind of global commons perspective, sharing of data, even if it's then made anonymous. There are ways around it. But if the good data is not there, open governance is absolutely impossible, and particularly for the poorest or the most vulnerable. So for me, it links the second part to measuring governance. How can we build on this concept of open governance rather than government to then start to develop qualitative indicators that are actually meaningful? Because quantitative is easy, it's a number. The qualitative ones are much harder, but they might actually be equally or more important. So.
Thank you, Elena. I'll respond at the end to some of your questions. Does anyone want to take over about data information sharing and what's the incentives within your respective communities to do it?
I'll speak on behalf of the AWS standard. By the way, if anyone wants it, I've got a little summary of the standard here I'm happy to share with you. One of the things we've found with implementing the standard and working with organisations is in step 2 of the standard you have to understand shared catchment challenges and develop some indicators around those. And that sounds really easy. Every time I start with a new project, we find that we're playing the role of bringing 5, 6 government agencies together who've all been sailing along for ages with these wonderful scientific reports that nobody ever reads, that sit on bookshelves, that are that aren't related. So there's a whole role there about bringing that data into a digestible form, because in order to be effective under the standard, we've got to compile, a semi-trailer load of information into something that might be 2 to 3, maximum 4 pages that a site manager can interpret in the context of their site water stewardship plan. So I think it's a great question. It's a big issue. The flip side of that is then making that data available. And of course, the requirement under the standard is that you publish and disclose. My goal in the long term, as we develop more certified sites and as we work in more catchments, is that all this information would be available on a shared basis, much the same as the Corporate Water Hub or whatever, or CDP, that we can start to build a database of catchment data that's quite transparent, but is also stakeholder endorsed. So you don't have to worry, this is someone's little spin on that catchment, that it's been through a stakeholder process to articulate what are the challenges in that catchment and what are the indicators.
Yeah, clearly from the academic world, we're moving to open access, and the challenges for open access, and it's logical. I think the academic world is in favor of it. Where a lot of our research is public funded, so it needs to come back to the public. And so the challenge is working with professional societies and publishing companies in terms of how do you still fund this, and just because it's web-based publishing doesn't mean it's free. And so so now there's different models looking at how we fund that. But I think beyond that is this democratization of information through the internet. And the communication science world is debating about how one website can speak to another. Can one website serve multiple user communities? What about scale, quality assurance? The genomics world has sort of figured it out, but it's sort of one set of, it's just so many letters, right? But they've had to create the bioinformatics tools that go along with analyzing that data set. But what have we done in the water space? And we're still thinking about that because the spatial and temporal issues. And water quality is probably much more complex in terms of trying to create these databases and open access systems with some quality assurance for use. So, but I think they're moving in that, and we have to interact with the computer science and communication science arenas in that regard.
Thank you, Joanne. Rudolf?
Thank you very much. Open governance. Maybe a quick reflection on what happened in Peru in the times of the Sendero Luminoso. Isolated areas, no government presence, and hence devolution to the lowest level of government, the municipalities and the community level. What was introduced in those times as a revival maybe of old traditions, old knowledge, was the Pachamama Raimi. Yeah? Intranslatable here, but it's respect for Mother Earth if you want to. And in this context, the government decided to not only, which often happens, delegate the participation to the community level, but they put the money where their mouth was, because it was the only way to maintain central government presence in a war zone. Okay? Now, in that context, open governance, it was community members who could make a proposal for investments in natural resource governance in their community, in their watershed, which was subject to community clearance for next tranches to be paid against perceived progress. Yeah? Now, let's not get into it, but the bottom line is that was very much a case of open governance that was then scaled up from natural resources to social security, women banking, and a lot of other things that have been considered useful for the social advancement of these isolated areas. A second aspect of open governance is mentioned here already, that is, where are the data, the big data of smart ICT? We had an issue in Ethiopia where the government said, yes, we're very much in favor of using smart ICT to inform our people, but we want to have the data here and not in Italy. End of project. And then an element around open governance that maybe reflects on the time it takes for these processes. Open governance also means that somebody needs to keep track of old commitments 10 years back and not just, do quick turnaround. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rudolf. Maybe a last point on Elena's question about water governance indicators or assessment, because this is typically something that we've been working on for 1 year and a half now at the OECD. That was the last slide 2 days ago. I think that we should stop saying that we can't measure governance because it's too place-based or only context-dependent. And I think we can all agree that there is not one size fits all, and this is truly the case, including within countries. I mean, if you take a country like Brazil, there is no one size fits all for all Brazil. I mean, it's a continental place, and then states have different levels of capacity, different levels of resources, and different degrees of complex problems as well. Having said that, I do think that for the 12 must-have when it comes especially to public policies, there is room for developing indicators that are indeed more fact-based indicators. And there's a lot. Typically, we carried out a project on stakeholder engagement recently at the OECD. We have very clear principles to set the framework conditions in place, and a traffic light system that can help self-assess whether the conditions are actually in place to ensure that it works properly. And I think you can disentangle governance indicators to governance issues. You can measure the effectiveness of river basin organizations. You can assess whether water information systems are actually delivering in terms of what the objectives are. You can measure the level of fragmentation of governments. This is something that we've been doing very much at the OECD, including the impact in terms of productivity. You can certainly have a grid that can help you assess the level of capacity of local authorities, especially in decentralized frameworks using some of the UN Habitat guidelines and so on. So you can, for each of these sub-items, I think, come to a set of indicators, and this is the work that is very much in the pipeline at the OECD. What I don't believe in is the composite index, but that is a different stand. I think that you've had a few experiences, and there was an example given about the Asia Water Governance Index, which is, we were talking about that earlier, ranking Singapore first and Mongolia last, and that has also financial implications in terms of the risk aversion of some of the investors. But you can probably compare what is comparable, and it's always the same. I believe very much in the clustering. I think you can have families of countries or families of cities or types of institutions that face similar challenges, and that indicators can help you get there. So probably this is a good idea for the next Zaragoza conference, for the next post-SDG indicator system to zoom into the indicators. We're happy to help you with that. So with this, I'd like you to join me and applaud our panelists. And thank you all very much. I'm not sure there's a coffee break. No, there's no coffee break because everybody runs away. Now you need to conclude the session. Thank you, Josefina.
Yeah. I just want to tell you that precisely. There is coffee outside. I'm worried that this time if you go out, that will be it. but I'm sure that many of you are really looking forward to having a coffee. So I suggest that you just go out and bring your coffee.